Now joining me now for more to talk about the weapons of mass distraction is war correspondent Keith Harmon Snow. Keith, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thanks, Lucy. How are you?
Now, what is your general take on why there is so much misinformation and conflicting reports when it comes to Libya?
Well, it's basically a psychological operation. There's an entire wing of the Pentagon and the State Department that's dedicated to psychological operations. These are perception management is the modern term. The previous term was propaganda. But psychological operation is to convince the American public or the English-speaking world and English news-consuming world that something's going on that may or may not be actually happening, and that's what we're seeing a lot of with respect to Libya.
Now, you don't think it's maybe in some parts the nature of the news business itself? I mean, we know that pictures tell the story. We know that conflict seems to be in vogue right now. So do you think that there's some, sort of more accidental forces at play where journalists are going out there and trying to find the most exciting thing that they could put on, and because they only have access to one side of the story, they may be sort of emphasizing the wrong sides and putting the wrong kind of information out there?
Well, we could take the example of Rwanda in 1994. What happened in those so-called 100 days of genocide was covered by journalists traveling with the Rwandan so-called rebels who are in power today. They committed genocide in Rwanda, and we've all been led to believe it was the opposite side. That was a psychological operation. There's no shortage of war zones to go to today where people are dying at the rate of 1,500 people a day in eastern Congo. Journalists go in and out of there, but it's not being reported at all. Same thing with Sudan. There's conflict going on in certain regions of Sudan. The conflict in Afghanistan. But what we're getting is a pro-U.S., pro-Pentagon, one-sided picture of a situation which fills the media with the idea that there's freedom fighters involved in Libya and that there's a government regime that's been an atrocious terrorist government since 1970, roughly. This is nonsense. Libya was an established government, whether we like them or not, just as North Korea and Iran are established governments, whether we like them or not, or the Sudan government. And what's happening against them is a war of aggression, with the media serving one side to portray the idea that Gaddafi is a terrorist and all these people have been killed and freedom fighters are involved. Freedom fighter, the language freedom fighter hasn't been used since the attacks by the Contras against Nicaragua in the 1980s.
Well, remember, in freedom, the Taliban used to be the freedom fighters, right, back in the 80s?
There you go. You have another example that's very good. And now they're, of course, the terrorist enemies. So it's a perfect example of how the media works.
I'm glad you brought up the example of Congo because, I mean, this is a conflict that since 1998 has killed more than 5.8 million people. And I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, is it really government psychological operations, or is there something more going on? Why is it that we have this selective attention span when it comes to which conflicts we're going to pay attention to? You know, the Congo doesn't seem to be very sexy or in vogue, so nobody in the mainstream media covers this, but Libya is suddenly the next best thing since sliced bread. Everyone seems to be flocking to the country, even though they don't seem to have the actual facts.
It's a combination. There's some accidental stuff going on. It's mostly self-censorship on the part of journalists who go and report something, but there is a lot of government-sponsored propaganda. Pentagon's pumping stuff out that's going into ABC News, Nightline, and CNN. And the Congo, for example, the war began in 1996 when the U.S. invaded. And the number of dead in Congo is over 10 million. It's not around 5 to 6 million. And it's not being covered because there's American multinationals all over the place getting the gold and the diamonds and the columbium tantalite and the other raw materials, including oil, like we have in Libya, coming out of Congo. People in America don't believe that we have our hands into the oil in what are we talking about? Libya. In fact, the oil maps of Libya are huge, and the oil concessions are huge, and it's a massive oil operation that's been going on with the support and the involvement of Italy, France, and Britain since 1970, since 1959 when the oil was discovered, but the U.S. hasn't had a piece of that pie. So the idea is to continue to convince the American public that genocide is happening in Libya, which is absolute nonsense, and therefore we need to take the all-powerful white American role is to go out there and save somebody that needs saving, when actually we're involved in the killing because I believe we're supporting the rebels in Libya.
I love it. Genocide only when it's politically convenient, I guess. And as an independent journalist, I mean, have you seen any sort of a change in terms of maybe your reports finding more of a market for your reports, more of an interest in alternative sources of media?
The story that I wrote about Libya has been picked up and read a lot because there's nobody out there who's really getting into the details behind the propaganda. Many Americans, even the left-wing leftists or progressive or alternative media, depending on how you define them, are pumping out some version of the propaganda that's been produced by the State Department, which is Gaddafi committed terrorism. He shot down the Pan Am flight over the Lockerbie flight. That was not a Gaddafi operation. It was a false flag operation. So the idea that Gaddafi is the premier terrorist who needs to be removed, of course, that argument gets a lot of play. But the biggest terrorists in the world are getting away with absolute murder at this very moment, and they haven't been, their names aren't even known in the media, like Maurice Templesman.
All right, Keith. Well, hopefully people will get some sort of an interest and start trying to find this information on their own, since Lord knows the mainstream media is not picking up on it. That was war correspondent Keith Harmon Snow.